Order, please. Order, please. We'll now begin with the daily routine, beginning with presenting and reading of petitions. The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, permission to make an introduction.
Permission granted.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the West Gallery, we have Dartmouth East resident Wayne Polam. Wayne has been an advocate for raising awareness regarding noise pollution off Highway 111. I'd ask Wayne to please stand and receive the warm welcome of the House of Assembly.
Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to table a petition, the operative clause reading, "We, the undersigned, are concerned citizens who urge our leaders of the province of Nova Scotia to act now to undertake an analysis of the noise pollution from Highway 111 with the goal of remedying as expeditiously as is possible for the many affected residents." There are 79 signatures, Mr. Speaker, and I have affixed my signature as per the rules of this House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The petition is tabled. We'll now move on to presenting reports of committees. The Honourable Member for Kings South.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, as Mr. Speaker, as Chair of the Standing Committee on Community Services, I wish to table the 2008 report from the Standing Committee of Community Services.
Just for point of clarity, is it 2008 or 2018? The Honourable Member for Kings South.
I'm stuck in the past, Mr. Speaker, but today, for you, it will be the 2018 report.
Thank you for the clarification. The report is tabled. We'll now move on to tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. As Speaker of the House of Assembly and pursuant to Section 163 of the Elections Act, I am pleased to table the report of the Chief Electoral Officer on the proceedings of the Cumberland South by-election held June the 19th, 2018, entitled Statement of Votes, Financial Information and Statistics. The report is tabled. Statements by ministers. Government notices of motion. The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to make an introduction.
Permission granted.
Joining us in the East Gallery today is Imad Aziz, our Business Continuity Manager at the Department of Internal Services, and his family. I'd ask my colleagues to join me in giving him a warm welcome.
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Imad Aziz, the Business Continuity Manager at the Department of Internal Services, was, like many of us, deeply affected by the Barhow family tragedy. And whereas using his professional background in risk prevention, Imad recognized the need for a free fire safety program for newcomers. And whereas Imad's initiative, 7 Bears, has been well received at the Ummah Mosque in Halifax, and that the Ummah Mosque in Halifax will soon be offering free fire detectors and fire safety training in English and Arabic. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly join me in thanking Imad and his group of volunteers for this important, potentially life-saving program for new immigrants. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. It is agreed. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye? Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Fisheries, Aquaculture and Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day to move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas during the 21st Annual Fisheries and Aquaculture Ministers Conference, Cedar Bay Grilling Company received the Minister's Award of Excellence. Whereas Cedar Bay Grilling Company received this award in recognition of their ongoing commitment to produce high-value, superior quality products. And whereas Cedar Bay Grilling Company's focus on unique value-added specific products has gained the company numerous awards and worldwide recognition since opening in 2009. Their active participation in trade shows has given them a better understanding of customers' needs and has helped them adopt and expand their product line to become highly successful international seafood exporters. Therefore, be resolved, all members of this House thank Cedar Bay Grilling Company and its staff for their commitment to their customers and to their community. Mr. Speaker, I'd ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? It is agreed. With all those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Fisheries, Aquaculture and Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas during the 21st Annual Fisheries and Aquaculture Ministers Conference, Jim Kennedy received the Minister's Award of Excellence. Whereas Jim Kennedy received this award in recognition of his service and dedication to the growth and advancement of Nova Scotia's seafood industry. In 1984, Jim established Louisbourg Seafoods of Louisbourg, Cape Breton, with a focus on hard work and making the most of fisheries resources that our rural communities rely upon. And whereas Jim Kennedy has built some of the most diversified seafood companies in the province, employing more than 500 people throughout the rural Cape Breton and eastern Nova Scotia. Yet his original commitment to bringing prosperity to coastal rural Nova Scotia remains the same. Therefore, be resolved that all members of this House thank Jim Kennedy for his determination and leadership as an industry builder and a seafood industry and the seafood industry of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? It is agreed. But all those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. We'll now move on to introduction of bills. The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 23 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Assessment Act.
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 23 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Assessment Act.
Bill number 99, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 23 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Assessment Act.
Ordered that the bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Maintain and Preserve Voluntary Blood Donations in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Maintain and Preserve Voluntary Blood Donations in Nova Scotia.
Bill number 100, entitled An Act to Maintain and Preserve Voluntary Blood Donations in Nova Scotia.
Ordered that the bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting the Registration of Tourist Accommodations.
The Honourable Government House Leader begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting the Registration of Tourist Accommodations.
Bill number 101, entitled An Act Respecting the Registration of Tourist Accommodations.
Ordered that the bill be read a second time on a future day. We'll now move on to notices of motion. Statements by members. The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of Pictou West's long-standing real estate properties has finally been sold. This is exciting news for the area, as the former Pictou Harbour Golf Club has been on the market for many years and the future of the property was uncertain. However, the new owners, who are from the United States, plan to revitalize the once popular golf course. Their extensive plans include turning the property into a hotel with a banquet hall, an RV park, and a cottage area. This important development will bring jobs, investment, and enhance our strong and growing tourism industry in the town of Pictou and surrounding areas. I want to welcome the new owners to Pictou and wish them many years of prosperity and success. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if anyone has strolled down Hollis Street in the past week, they may have found themselves caught walking on sidewalks narrowed by snowbanks alongside faculty members of the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. They are a hard group to miss. Since last Friday, the faculty of NASCAD, or FunSCAD, has been on strike since 97.5% of its members voted in favour of action after an impasse was reached between faculty and the administration. The teachers and librarians' protest can be heard down Hollis and up Duke, not just because of the chants and cowbells, but because every other driver that passes them at rush hour signifies their support by adhering to the protesters' signs that read, "Honk if you love art." These teachers, who are joined by their students, are hoping for a quick resolve and that agreeable terms will be found in negotiations, which have been ongoing and tumultuous since July. Mr. Speaker, I stand today in solidarity, like many of those Halifax drivers and NASCAD students, with my brothers and sisters of FunSCAD, and I hope they are successful in their endeavours.
The honourable member for Clayton Park West.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to make an introduction.
Permission granted.
We have with us in the East Gallery Mr. George Crocker, a neighbour, a friend, and somebody I admire with great respect for what he's doing now. We're helping. He's a great advocate for brain injury, and I will read his member statement. Please welcome him with in the House. Mr. Speaker, I would like to recognize a constituent and a neighbour who devotes his time to bringing awareness to a cause that has affected his own life. George Crocker is serving his second year with the Brain Injury Association of Nova Scotia. In his role on the board, he develops policies to help people cope while suffering from brain injury. George himself is someone who has endured brain injury after experiencing a stroke, and he finds volunteer work to so satisfying because he can relate to what these individuals are going through and can provide them with the necessary resources and knows how essential the recovery process is. Mr. Crocker also works with the group called Head On at the Veterans Memorial Hospital, which is a discussion group for people who have suffered brain injury. Mr. Speaker, this House of Assembly, join me in applauding George for rising above his difficulties in order to help those around him. Thank you, George.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise to acknowledge Richard Watton's exceptional musical achievements. Richard began his musical endeavours at Caldwell Road Elementary, playing the trumpet and French horn in the grade 6 band program. Richard has enjoyed mentoring elementary students coming into the band. Cole Harbour High School recently nominated Richard to attend an honours band weekend at Mount Allison University, and he gladly accepted. Richard also auditioned and was accepted immediately into the Nova Scotia Youth Orchestra managed by Symphony Nova Scotia. In addition, Flight Sergeant Richard Watton is also the recipient of the Outstanding Air Cadet Military Band Musician. As a member of the Nova Scotia Tri-Service Band, he performed at the 2017-2018 Royal Nova Scotia International Tattoo. Mr. Speaker, I ask everyone in the legislature to join me in acknowledging Richard Watton for his profound dedication to music. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to wish my dear friend and colleague, the member for Dartmouth North, best of luck this weekend as she braves the ice-cold waters of our shared Lake Bannock in the Blue Toes for Blue Nose fundraiser. Alongside other celebrity dippers, the MLA for Dartmouth North will be jumping into the freezing, paralyzingly cold waters of Lake Bannock, which may need to be cleared with ice picks, to help raise money for the amazing Dartmouth Family Centre and the Dartmouth North Community Food Centre. It's a truly awesome and fun event, although I have to say I'm happy it's happening on her side of Lake Bannock, thereby sparing me from doing the same, as As the event takes place in Dartmouth North, I'll be happy to cheer her on and hold the towel when she emerges from the icy lake.
The member for King South. The member for King South. The member for King South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 4 years ago, I shared with this House the winner of the Acadia University Student Volunteer of the Year Award. Today, I am proud to acknowledge that same individual for another remarkable achievement. Todd Dow from Colebrook is a third-year medical student at Dalhousie University and has been named as one of 17 recipients of the 2018 Canadian Medical Hall of Fame Award. This special award is given to a medical student with an established track record of community leadership, superior communication skills, and demonstrated interest in advancing knowledge. This award includes a cash prize of $5,000 and a travel subsidy to attend the 2019 Canadian Medical Hall of Fame induction ceremony in Montreal this May, where he will have the opportunity to meet with Medical Hall of Fame laureates and interact with health leaders from across the country. I ask the members of the Nova Scotia House of Assembly to join me in congratulating Todd Dow on this award and recognizing his outstanding academic, volunteer, and leadership achievements. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the sudden loss of a loved one can be devastating, but the love of music can be both healing and inspirational, as two amazing young ladies have demonstrated. Laurel and Ella McClellan lost their father, Brian, suddenly on September 22, 2018. Brian had a great passion for music and was a remarkable guitarist. He always encouraged his girls to strive for greatness with their own musical ability, and the trio was seen many times playing in church functions and community events. On December 1, 2018, Laurel and Ella showcased their growing talent by performing an amazing concert with friends and family in dedication of the musical legacy of their father, and successfully raised $2,125 for the Cape Breton Cancer Patient Care Fund. I rise today to recognize the amazing contribution of both Laurel and Ella to their family, friends, and community at large. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Yarmouth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Yarmouth and Area Chamber of Commerce celebrated our local business community at its 2018 Business Awards, and the winner of Business of the Year for 1 to 10 employees was Yarmouth Big Bounce Rentals. Yarmouth Big Bounce Rentals provides rental and party services for birthdays, festivals, exhibitions, fundraisers, community events, and school fairs in Yarmouth, Southwest Nova, and beyond. I ask this House to join me in congratulating Yarmouth Big Bounce Rentals on being named the Yarmouth and Area Chamber of Commerce 2018 Business of the Year, and wish them continued success in our community.
The member for Argyll-Barrington.
Mr. Speaker, on March 4, 2019, the town of Clark's Harbour celebrated the centennial anniversary of its incorporation. Located on the southernmost tip of Nova Scotia, the island town was once a bustling town with busy shops, restaurants, and hotels, and boasted a thriving waterfront with numerous wharves and rich fishing grounds. With a strong sense of community pride, Clark's Harbour continues to prosper and is known worldwide for its famous Cape Island-style boat. The town celebrates its milestone throughout the year with special events scheduled every month. I'd like to take this opportunity to wish the town of Clark's Harbour a happy 100th birthday and hope it will continue to thrive over the next 100 years and beyond. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize the youth at the Dartmouth North Boys and Girls Club, who, during the week of Valentine's Day, brought joy, smiles, and laughter to total strangers at the Alderney Ferry Terminal by flower bombing them. In February, the club was gifted a huge amount of cut flowers by Bloomex Canada, and with the help of volunteers from RBC, the youth and staff individually wrapped over 500 roses and tulips and then hit the ferry terminal to spread some love. Standing with buckets of flowers as people got on and off the ferry, the group simply handed them out to people in an effort to brighten their day and put a smile on their face. Mr. Speaker, in a world where so many can be suspicious of strangers, it is simply wonderful to know that random acts of kindness can still bring people together in love and community. I ask the members of this House to join me in thanking the youth and staff of the Dartmouth North Boys and Girls Club for their generous act toward their Dartmouth neighbours. Thank you.
The member for Lunenburg West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize Tia Wombolt of Bridgewater. Tia and her partner, Jordan Henderson of Truro, won a silver medal in the female trampoline synchro competition at the recent 2019 Canada Winter Games in Red Deer, Alberta. This was impressive considering that the duo practiced together only 2 times before their medal-winning performance. It was the first time that synchro was offered at the Games. Tia is a member of the Dartmouth Titans Gymnastics and Trampoline Club, has trained in trampoline for almost 10 years. She said that she had an absolutely amazing experience at the Winter Games and really enjoyed the chance to cheer on and support other Nova Scotian athletes competing in the sports they love. I ask all members of the Nova Scotia Legislature to join me in wishing Tia Wombolt all the best as she graduates from Mount St. Vincent University this spring with a degree in Child and Youth Studies and continues to compete in Elite Canada and Nationals later this year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, 30 of the best curling clubs in the world will arrive in Pictou County between November the 5th and 10th for the largest Grand Slam curling event ever to be held at the Pictou County Wellness Centre. It was 166 years ago today, March the 7th, 1853, that the first curling occurred in Glasgow. Curling was played outdoors for the first 20 years prior to the first indoor facility, which was opened in 1874. However, it was 63 years later, in 1937, before the first artificial ice was used at the Blue Nose Curling Club. Today, the Blue Nose Curling Club is the 3rd oldest in Nova Scotia and the 11th oldest in Canada. It officially took the name Blue Nose Curling Club on January the 12th, 1869. Today, the club operates from its location on Park Street, where a 4-sheet rink was constructed in 1990. I'd like to ask all members of this legislature to recognize the commitment and diligent work of the executive in Glasgow on this historic setting day. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, March is Social Workers Month. This year's theme is Real People, Real Change. It is a time to think about the contributions of social workers across this province in schools, hospitals, long-term care facilities, in the Department of Community Service, and in community agencies. The social work profession has helped to shape our province, and social workers engage with empathy and solidarity with clients and are often joined with them in a struggle for social justice. Social workers identify changes needed, they resist and propose alternatives to the systems that continue to oppress many historically marginalized people. I recognize their work and also the College of Social Workers, and I am grateful for them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is an honour to rise today to recognize West Kings District High School administrator and teacher Donna Griffin. Described by her students as an extraordinary human who has the biggest heart, Donna has deeply impacted the lives of her students. Donna always sees the best in her pupils and goes above and beyond to help them see and realize their potential. She has contributed to the academic success of many, and to some, having her in their lives has been life-saving. Donna has been a driving force with the West Kings Student Council and has served as a leader with the Legion Leadership Training Camp. Furthermore, each year, Donna is an inspiration behind a remarkable student-led West Kings Remembrance Day service. Mr. Speaker, I request the House join me in recognizing Donna Griffin of West Kings District High School, whose legacy and presence will be forever an influential impact on the lives of the young people she meets. Thank you.
The member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize Norm Collins, a Dartmouth East resident and president of the Crosswalk Safety Society. Norm has worked tirelessly for the installation of crosswalk flags in Dartmouth East and all over Halifax. His model, Mr. Speaker, has sparked other crosswalk safety societies all over Nova Scotia with similar safety goals. As a parent in a constituency with so many schools, I understand the important role crosswalk flags play in our safety. I wish to commend Norm Collins and the Crosswalk Safety Society for his contributions to Dartmouth East and the province as a whole. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Antigonish.
Mr. Speaker, my community of Antigonish is fortunate to enjoy a diverse and varied population. And this was celebrated on February 8th and 9th through a special Theatre Antigonish production called The Shoe Project. The Shoe Project brought to the stage 8 immigrant women who had worked since last fall to write and develop their story for presentation. The production was led by local writer Ann Simpson and local actor Laura Teasdale. Novelist Catherine Grover launched the Shoe Project 6 years ago in Toronto, and since then, immigrant women in many communities in Canada have had the opportunity to go through a 10-week writing workshop and then work with a theatre professional to bring their piece to the stage. The Shoe Project was a collaborative effort, including funding by Nova Scotia's Culture and Innovation Fund, along with local sponsorship from Arts Health Antigonish, and formed in partnership with Theatre Antigonish and the Antigonish County Adult Learning Association, or ACALA. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to congratulate all involved, including the 8 women who shared their stories: Karen Bissonette, Renee Romero Brown, Willie Dykers, Almiunda Garcia, Jyotsna Yan, Anna Joshi, Su Kyung Lee, and Yen Nok Nyun, and all who worked behind the scenes to bring the Shoe Project to the stage. Thank you.
The member for Colchester Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, involved with the Special Olympics for almost 20 years, Maura Hunter of Lower Harmony will be heading to the World Games in the United Arab Emirates as a coach with the Canadian swim team. Maura has attended the World Games in previous years, first as a mother to Special Olympic swimmer Matthew Hunter during the Games in Greece, and then as a family liaison at the Los Angeles Games. Focused on helping to make this the best possible experience for the athletes, this will be her first time attending as a coach. I'd like to thank Maura Hunter for her guidance and devotion to the Special Olympic swim team. I'd also like to wish the Canadian swim team the best of luck at the upcoming 2019 Special Olympics World Summer Games, March 14th to the 21st in Abu Dhabi.
The member for Preston Dartmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to recognize Micah Smith of North Preston, a musical talent who is occasionally backup singer for Rennie Smith, but also a highly trained massage therapist. She always wanted to help people, which led Maisha to actively pursue a career in massage therapy, graduating in 2014 and began working as an independent contractor at Massage Addict. She continued her study focused on oncology massage therapy at a prestigious institute in Boston to acquire the skills to help relieve pain in cancer patients. I recognize and congratulate Micah Smith for achieving this high-level professionalism and wish her every success in opening at-home practice.
The member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to acknowledge Dan McIntosh, an award-winning journalist for CTV Atlantic News. Dan grew up in Stellarton and graduated from St. FX University, where he worked on the campus newspaper, radio station, and on stage at the Bauer Theatre. After graduating, Dan joined CKEC in New Glasgow before transitioning to transitioning to TV. Over his career, Dan's logged close to 2 million kilometers, covering the Westray mine disaster, royal visits, and interviews with almost every prime minister from Pierre Elliott Trudeau to Justin Trudeau. In 2019, Dan McIntosh will have worked in television and radio for 37 years. I'd like to thank Dan for his dedication and look forward to listening to his signature, "I'm Dan McIntosh," for years to come. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Hants East.
Mr. Speaker, the iconic phrase, "Gentlemen, start your engines," will have to be revised. Due in part to 3 daring young women who suit up and compete against the men in the thrilling sport of car racing. East Hants is proud of Emily Meehan of Rawdon, who along with Emma McMillan of Glenholm and Megan Perot of Beaverbank made history on the night of August 3rd at Scotia Speed World. It was the first time that the track ever checker flagged females in all 3 of the feature races the same night. It was an exciting evening at the track, Mr. Speaker. The victories of Emily, Emma, and Megan in a male-dominated sport will inspire many females, young and old, to step bravely into an arena of competition, knowing that the barriers that have stood between them and entrance into a male-dominated field are crumbling one by one. So it will be. Ladies and gentlemen, start your engines. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to offer congratulations to our own Emily Meehan and her 2 colleagues for their bravery and historic victories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Jacob Schaffelberg is a young soccer player from Port Williams, Nova Scotia. He has now become a professional soccer player with Toronto FC. While he was signed with the second-tier club, he has actually been playing with the big league team. Toronto FC coach Michael Bradley states he's a kid who's not afraid, has speed, the ability to run with the ball, and when he gets into a position with the ball on his left foot, he knows how to put it into a dangerous area. And he's a great kid. Congratulations to Jacob on his great accomplishment and best wishes on his future career. Congratulations also to his parents, Mike and Linda Schaffelberg. Thank you.
Just a quick reminder, there's a lot of chatter. It's getting hard to hear the member statements, so I ask that everybody just keep their chatter down to a dull roar, please. The member for Clare Digby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll speak loudly here. Last July, I participated in the Maritime NHLers for Kids Golf Tournament at the Digby Pines, along with such hockey sports personalities as Ron McLean, Brad Marchand, Julian Saunier, and Ryan Graves. In addition to the tournament, the event included a gala dinner, auction, and a question and answer session for our young hockey players with the sports celebrities. The 2-day event is part of the Maritime NHLers for Kids efforts to ensure that hockey is accessible to all children who want to play. Since the tournament started, it has donated $7,500 to the Digby Annapolis Jumpstart program. In the last 4 years, the total to our local programs has reached $23,000 and over $250,000 to Jumpstart programs across the Maritimes. The Clare Digby Minor Hockey Association also received 25 full sets of hockey outfits, which it used in a program funded by Hockey Nova Scotia to encourage young girls to play hockey. Over 25 little girls had a great time learning hockey this year. At the cost of associating with playing hockey continues to rise, I want to recognize the Maritime NHLers for Kids and their efforts for hockey to be accessible for all young players. Thank you very much.
The member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to congratulate Mr. Leroy Peach of Port Morion on his 8th book titled Rhymes of a Grateful Caper. Leroy is a retired English teacher whose poetry is of place and belonging, with an emphasis on the singing landscapes and seascapes of Cape Breton. Most poems also reflect his love of nature. Leroy Peach has never lost his love for Cape Breton and was very grateful that he was able to retire in Port Morion in 1989. I stand here today to acknowledge and thank Leroy and state that Port Morion is very fortunate to have him, as he is a tireless volunteer in that community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's with great sadness that we must bid farewell to a dear friend, Truro's Frank McKay, a genuine, kind-hearted, positive soul with an indomitable spirit and a voice to match, as he died last night in Halifax after a triple bypass surgery. Frank was a legend in his own time, lead singer of the Lincolns, Soma, and many theatrical shows, including John Gray's Rock and Roll, an original Canadian musical based on the true story of the Lincolns, which Frank performed across Canada to great acclaim. Many of us who have performed with Frank and known him over the years will mourn the loss of this great friend and truly incredible performer. Oh, Danny boy, the pipes are calling from glen to glen and down the mountainside. The summer's gone and all the roses fallen. 'Tis you must go, my love, while we must bide. Rip, dear Frank, you will not be forgotten. Thank you.
The member for Guysborough, Eastern Shore, Tracadie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to acknowledge the life's work of historian Norma Cook of Isaacs Harbour. She has brought to life the history of Guysborough County through her charmingly handwritten notes, an extensive collection of newspaper clippings, memorabilia, and artifacts. Norma served as the postmaster in the Isaacs Harbour Post Office for almost 28 years, where she gathered and shared stories with tourists and locals alike, even providing a few key genealogical connections for those on the hunt of their own family ancestry. Numerous other Nova Scotia historians have called on Norma Cook's rendition of history for their own research and published works. It's not a reach to say that the treasured local history of Isaacs Harbour could very well be forgotten had Norma not taken it upon herself to have it recorded and saved. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank Norma for her important contribution to the preservation of Isaacs Harbour rich history through her thoughtful archiving and appeal to her curiosity and enthusiasm to continue her much appreciated handiwork. Thank you.
The member for Queen Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in October 2018, the 14th biannual Liverpool International Theatre Festival opened with Oliver's Bench, an original play by Liverpool playwright Greg Tuddy. Skillfully directed by the playwright himself, this dramatic piece had no dialogue. Its story told to a full house at the Astor Theatre through the acting of cast members Al Steele, Annette Burke, and Teresa Clark. Mr. Speaker, I would like to congratulate and applaud the writer, cast, and crew of this Winds of Change Dramatic Society production, which was awarded the Outstanding Ensemble Production at the festival. In addition, it was nominated in every award category for which it was eligible. Oliver's Bench was truly a memorable event at the Astor Theatre. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Halifax-Armdale.
Mr. Speaker, in recognition of International Women's Day, Yawm al-Mar'a al-Alami, I stand as an elected member of this historic legislature in its 200th year to pay tribute to the most amazing, remarkable woman that has made a lasting mark on my life, Huda Frances Metledge, my mother. Huda's the one who has guided me along the right path in life and has devoted her energy to caring for our family. She left her parents and her home in Lebanon at a very young age to join her husband-to-be, my father Stephen, to begin a new life together in what was uncharted territory. Today, over 54 years later, and with the passing of my father, she continues to show us her strength, courage, resilience, and love in spite of the great loss of her lifelong partner. Today, I want to honor her remarkable contribution and celebrate Women's Day to commemorate the inspiring role of women around the world. Thank you.
The member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to congratulate Carrie Campbell of Florence on the release of her book, Blood Bonds, Stories from the Lily and Quinn series. Carrie's always been has always had an addiction for reading and writing. She has taken part in National Novel Writing Month and has written several novels in rough draft form and has completed 4 anthologies that were traditionally published. I would like to take this opportunity to wish Carrie success with all her present and future endeavors. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Just wanted to give a quick reminder that for member statements, we are not to repeat songs, recite songs, poems, etc. So just a quick reminder for the future. The member for Timberley Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to recognize Daniel Higgins, a resident of Timberley and a coach of the Sir John A. Macdonald High School men's varsity basketball team. In addition to coaching the Sir John A. Flames, Daniel has been an active coach with the St. Margaret's Bay Fury and has traveled with basketball teams to Maine, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Montreal, for example. He has assisted Basketball Nova Scotia with clinics and initiatives to help grow the sport in Nova Scotia and devotes at least 5 days per week to coaching. Dan's passion for basketball and talent as a coach has helped to build strong, confident athletes both physically and mentally. Through Dan's guidance, he has succeeded in encouraging his players to work hard, be persistent, and always have a positive attitude. His sound advice and the special connection he shares with players has resulted in successful athletes both on and off the court. I ask the members of the Nova Scotia House of Assembly to join me in congratulating Dan for his achievement of becoming a well-respected coach in the basketball community throughout the province and thank him for sharing his talent and guiding our youth to be happy, healthy members of the community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, on the eve of International Women's Day, I rise today to acknowledge and congratulate Eva Landry of Sampsonville on the publication of her nonfiction book entitled Just a Farm Girl. Eva is one of Richmond County's most avid volunteers and well-known educators. Eva was a teacher as well as one of the first female principals in Richmond County, and was the first woman to become superintendent of schools in the county. In 1980, she became the first female inspector of schools in Nova Scotia. Eva has been honoured with the Order of Nova Scotia, the Order of Canada, and the Queen's Golden Jubilee Medal. Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank Eva for her service, her guidance, and to offer my congratulations on her latest in a long list of impressive accomplishments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Sydney Whitney Pier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to congratulate Member 2 Development Corporation, who has been named one of Canada's top managed companies by Deloitte for 2019. Mr. Speaker, this marks the first Mi'kmaq-owned and led corporation to receive the designation. Mr. Speaker, it includes many different entities: the Trade and Convention Centre, Member 2 Gaming, Member 2 Sport and Wellness, the Lanes at Member 2, Kiju's Restaurant, Member 2 Real Estate, Member 2 Market, Member 2 Data Centre, Member 2 Entertainment Centre, and the Health Park property, just to name a few. Mr. Speaker, I rise in my place today and I ask all members to congratulate Chief Terry Paul and all of the leadership with Member 2 Development Corporation for the amazing economic story that is not only transforming Member 2, but transforming our entire community. Thank you.
The member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, today I'd like to recognize Plant Manager Tyler McLeod and his staff at Western Foods in Amherst. Together, from payroll deductions and other fundraisers, they have raised over $75,000 for the Cumberland Regional Healthcare Centre for the Maternal Child Care Unit. This money will be matched by Weston Seeding Stronger Communities Initiative. The money will help purchase a new transport incubator, a portable ultrasound unit, and a Billy blanket. Tyler and his staff have worked hard and give freely to give generously back to their communities. They recognize the need and have worked hard through labour and volunteer work to make this happen. Today, I would like to thank them for being so generous to our community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Fairview Clayton Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as a Mount St. Vincent alumnus and neighbour, I'm always proud to hear about other students' accomplishments. Earlier this week, the Mount Mystics women's basketball team defeated the St. Thomas University Tommies. In an undefeated 23 games, the basketball team claimed the ACAA-AASC championship title. The team also ranked second nationally and will compete at the national championships next week in Quebec. In addition to the basketball team's success, the Mounts women's volleyball and soccer teams also won their ACAA championships. I ask the members of this House of Assembly to join me in celebrating the Mounts women's sports teams on their incredible accomplishments this year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Cumberland South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to congratulate Roger Bacon, the 21st Premier of Nova Scotia, on his first published book. Premier Bacon, along with his lifelong friend Morris Hoig, authored this book called From Farmer to Premier, sold out in the first printing within 90 minutes of hitting the shelves. The book covers Bacon's life before, during, and after politics, starting on a small farm in the 30s during the Depression. Whether Roger Bacon was a farmer, a county councillor, a cabinet minister, or premier, he changed the way he saw himself and the way he treated others. Please join me in congratulating Premier Bacon and Morris Hoig on this outstanding book, and I can personally attest to myself, thank you to the member from Cumberland North, that this book is a value read. And in the words of Premier Bacon, that a boy, farmer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Oh, sorry, Alon.
The member for Waverley, Fall River, Beaverbank.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recognize a group of students from the Holland Road Elementary School in the community of Fletcher's Lake who had a goal to make everyone in their school feel welcome. The Friendship Tree Project was the idea of Ellen Ruderham, and she was then joined by her two friends, Gabby Allen and Nate Hallett. After approval from the principal, the three students designed and created a tree which now hangs in the hallway of the school. Students post a heart-shaped note on the tree for each act of kindness done by other students. The students are amazed to see the many notes and the inspiration to think up ways they can perform more acts of kindness. I thank Alan, Gabby, and Nate for leading this project and spread the generosity of kindness among their fellow students. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I stand today to congratulate and mention a dear friend of mine, Ann Emmett of Bray Shore, Pictou County. Ann, who is most deserving, was recently awarded the Senate 150 Medal. Ann and her husband Mike have been residents of Pictou West since 1993. She is a person who does not enjoy the limelight, but is always busy behind the scenes. She has been a board member for the Ship Hector Foundation and was chair for the Hector Key Society for 5 years. She was instrumental as the founding chair of Dean's, Destination Eastern and Northumberland Shores, and the final chair of the Pictou County Tourism Association. Ann is an active Karma volunteer and organization which helps the local feline population. You will see her at different venues promoting and raising awareness of the organization. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our province has reason to be very proud of all of our young athletes who recently returned from the 2019 Canada Summer Games in Red Deer, Alberta. I want to particularly congratulate some of the members of Team Nova Scotia who live in the constituency of Chester St. Margaret's. Bridget McLean, a grade 10 student and snowboard racer from Glenhaven, qualified this year in the giant slalom and the border cross events. This was Bridget's first experience at the Canada Games, and she placed a very respectable 4th overall in her snowboard event. Kate McKinnon from East Chester, named by the Provincial Snowboarding Association as the 2016 Female Snowboarder of the Year, was also a member of Team Nova Scotia and took 6th place against a tough field in the female parallel giant slalom event. Taylor Stevens from Chester was a member of Skip Callie Moore's curling team, which defeated Team New Brunswick, bringing home bronze for Nova Scotia. Team Moore defeated BC, Northwest Territories, Prince Edward Island and Saskatchewan en route to the bronze. I ask the members of this Assembly to join me in congratulating these young athletes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to acknowledge Captain Kevin Byrne upon receiving the RCSU Commanding Officer's Commendation. Captain Byrne was presented the award for his outstanding professionalism and leadership as Commanding Officer at 18 Dartmouth's Lions Royal Canadian Air Cadet Squadron. The squadron unexpectedly lost their usual meeting spot, and Captain Byrne made the transition to a temporary meeting place smooth and seamless for everyone involved during this difficult time with little to no interruption to cadet activities. The cadets are extremely thankful for his planning and communication abilities. Captain Byrne accepted this award on behalf of officers and staff, parents, cadets, and the Shearwater Military Family Resource Centre. I ask all members of the Nova Scotia Legislature to join me in thanking Captain Kevin Byrne for his dedication and time giving back to our community once again. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to speak of 2 amazing young girls from Spryfield, Emma and Maya Campbell. Emma and Maya have been named to the Nova Scotia Provincial Basketball Team Under 14 Division. They began playing basketball at the age 11 with our local basketball club, Express Basketball. They now play for the Halifax Hurricanes Division 1 Under 14, and they also play for Elizabeth Sutherland School. This spring, they will join the provincial team. Emma and Maya have been nicknamed the Twin Towers by their teammates and coaches. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to congratulate Emma and Maya for their outstanding performance in the sport and wish them the best of luck as they move on to the next level playing on the provincial teams. Our community is so proud of these young ladies and we wish them continued success in their sport. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Colchester Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on March the 3rd, the Truro Sport Heritage Society honoured the athletic accomplishments of local athletes and volunteers from 2018 during its 35th annual awards dinner. The Burgess family was awarded the Armstrong Family Award for 5 generations worth of family contributions to local curling. Their contribution began back in 1952 when a Burgess relative represented Nova Scotia at the Brier on 3 occasions, 52, 55, and 56. Generations of the Burgess family have represented Nova Scotia at the Brier, National Seniors Championships, Nova Scotia Johnson Cup, the Canada Games, just to name a few. The fifth and newest generation are definitely making their family proud with well-known athletes such as Andrew, Chris, Lindsay, and Carly Burgess. Congratulations to the entire Burgess family on receiving this well-deserved honor. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Lunenburg West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Brian Langley of Bridgewater was inducted into the Lunenburg County Sport Heritage Society Wall of Fame in November of 2018. He was honoured for his strong ties to Lunenburg County, his contribution to track and field, and his commitment and dedication to sport. Beginning in 1986, he was chef de mission for the Canadian team for the World Championships held in New York, Rome, Tokyo, Stuttgart, and Gothenburg. He served on the board of Athletics Nova Scotia and Athletics Canada for more than a decade and received the Hugh Noble Award from the Nova Scotia School Athletic Federation for contribution to school sport. He was team leader for the Canadian track team at the 1992 Olympic Games and the former president of the Pacific Conference Federation. He officiated at numerous national championships, Commonwealth Games, Pan American Games, World Student Games, and World Championships. Brian received the Queen's Jubilee Medal for his contribution to Canadian culture, and he was inducted into the Nova Scotia Sport Hall of Fame in 2000. I ask all members to join me in congratulating Brian Langley for his outstanding contribution to Nova Scotia and Canadian sport.
The honourable member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to recognize Ken Willamant, branch manager and staff at the Sackville Public Library. Their roles go well beyond providing books and quiet spaces to read, Mr. Speaker. With the help of Grant, the Cobequid Community Health Board, for youth-based programs, the library has started a teen zone. Mr. Speaker, the program reaches up to 60 participants a week and teach them how to prepare recipes. Sometimes the participants actually go to the grocery store with staff to purchase the food and also learn additional life skills like budgeting, Mr. Speaker. The library will soon get a new teaching kitchen that they're installing as we speak, where these programs will be taught. I'd like to thank Ken and other staff at the Sackville Library for becoming a cornerstone of our community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Antigonish.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This summer, from July 31st to August 3rd, Antigonish will host Nova Scotia's 55-plus Summer Games. Our community is excited to be welcoming the athletes and their families from across the province and look forward to offering the same level of hospitality offered to participants at last year's National Special Olympics Summer Games. Our community is getting ready. Town and county councils have come together, each naming a co-councillor as co-chair. Diana Roberts for the town and Vaughn Chisholm for the county. Most events will take place around St. FX University, taking advantage of its many upgraded sporting facilities, but others will be held at Kepik Mountain and Loch Arbor Lake. Activities will include geocaching, disc golf, mountain biking, tennis, rowing, and more. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to invite all Nova Scotians to come to Antigonish to cheer on the athletes competing in Nova Scotia's 55-plus games. Thank you.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to acknowledge the Coxheath Hills Wilderness Trail Association, which recently received $67,000 from the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency. These funds will be used to remodel the downstairs kitchen in the community hall located at the entrance to the Coxheath Hills Wilderness Trail. As part of the project, the CBRM has also contributed $15,000. Offering a panoramic view of the greater Sydney area, Coxheath Hills offers a year-round hiking destination, and hopefully this new kitchen will draw crowds of tourists for a hike and lunch program. Mr. Speaker, I stand today to thank everyone who has spent many hours volunteering their time to help the Coxheath Hills Wilderness Association become a main activity for locals and tourists alike. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. We'll now get ready to move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we're all watching as events play out in Ottawa with respect to the alleged interference by various members of the federal government in the SNC-Lavalin affair. The discussion in Ottawa underpins one of the fundamental tenets of Western democracy, and that is that the court should be free from influence or interference from legislators. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Premier is, does the Premier agree that it is a key principle of our democracy to ensure a separation of the judicial, the legislative, and the executive branches of government?
The Honourable Premier.
Yes.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Some agreement, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in 2018, the term of the Chief Judge of the Provincial Court expired, and the Chief Judge was appointed to the role. My question for the Premier, Mr. Speaker, is what role or influence did the Premier or his office play in the decision to appoint Judge Williams?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you would know, Chief Williams was actually in that post. She'd been there for 5 years. If she goes back successively, they would have seen a number of people who would have gone for another 5 years. I believe there was a recommendation with 2 potential candidates. Mr. Speaker, Chief Williams was one of them. I want to congratulate her for outstanding work with us and the work she's been doing, ensuring that we have the first wellness court, first of its kind in Canada, and we look forward to continuing to work with her. And Mr. Speaker, I also want to thank her for the work that she's been doing on the inquiry around the Home for Colour Children to understand how all branches of what we expect who should work independently, how they've all broken down for minorities in this province.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and the Premier is correct. It was a reappointment, and there was a process. And I'd like to ask the Premier, is the Premier confident that the proper process was followed in reappointing the Chief Judge?
The Honourable Premier. Mr. Speaker, I have all the confidence in the judiciary who made the recommendations. They weren't recommendations that came to us, Mr. Speaker. I believe the process they used was the one that has been used for quite some time, but I do also want to congratulate and thank Chief Justice for her tremendous work in the Provincial Court. Chief Justice MacDonald, Mr. Speaker, is also retiring. He has done exemplary service for the people of our province. And I'm very proud, quite frankly, that this judiciary reflects the reality of Nova Scotia today. We have half of our judges are women, Mr. Speaker. We have more minorities than ever in our history, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank all those who continue to make sure that the independent branch of the judiciary reflects the reality of this province, and I'm very proud to be part of a government, Mr. Speaker, that has continued to provide equal access to justice in this province.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Cheryl Burbridge is an LPN at the ER at the Valley Regional, and she says that conditions on the floor at her emergency department are so overcrowded now that they're actually dangerous, and that nurses there are having to look after so many patients that it amounts to being a violation of their standards of practice. Staff in that ER are working at 200% capacity many days. So I want to ask the Premier, wouldn't it be better to make the investments in health care that would take the pressure off ERs rather than run a generation of nurses into the ground?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman for the question. Mr. Speaker, that's why we continue to invest in collaborative care model, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that people have access to primary health care in community, Mr. Speaker. As he would know, the model of health care delivery is changing rapidly. He would also know family practice nurses are becoming an important part of that. That's why we continue to hire more family practice nurses to become part of that team, nurse practitioners as well. He's heard me say many times that some of our community social workers should be part of that a whole health care team model, and that's how we continue to believe that we can lessen the pressure on our emergency rooms across the province by continuing to build the model of health care that health care professionals want to work in today.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
In Lower Sackville, the Cobequid is keeping patients overnight because the other ERs are so overcrowded there's no place to make the transfer that they're supposed to. Staff are working overtime in order for this to happen. And last year, the NSHA's nurse overtime budget was exceeded by a factor of more than 4. So I want to ask the Premier, wouldn't it be a better use of our resources to make the investments that would take the pressure off ERs in the first place, rather than continue to spend endlessly on overtime?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, that's exactly what we're doing, Mr. Speaker. We've heard me talk about the redevelopment of the healthcare infrastructure they have in the capital region, the redevelopment of the infrastructure in Cape Breton. We're talking about building the collaborative care centres across the province, Mr. Speaker. That's exactly what we're doing, Mr. Speaker, building the infrastructure that had not been invested in, Mr. Speaker, for decades. We need to make sure we make those investments because that's how we will attract, retain healthcare providers and build the appropriate healthcare environment where all of our healthcare professionals want to work in.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on his final supplementary.
But the question of emergency room staffing across the province is not becoming less of an issue. It's becoming more of an issue all the time. We've learned just lately that the QE2 is having a hard time filling nursing shifts at the Rapid Assessment Unit following changes in what the hospital counts or doesn't count as overtime. While emergency RMs are meant to staff that unit, the department is now asking LPNs without emergency training to fill those shifts. So I want to ask the Premier, wouldn't we be better to make the investments in more nurses and lessen the pressure on ERs in the first place, rather than leaving our emergency rooms understaffed?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I want to remind him, I'm sure he paid close attention to the fact when the Minister of Finance tabled her capital plan this morning, Mr. Speaker, there is a significant investment in healthcare infrastructure to deal with the very issues that the Honourable Member is talking about. Mr. Speaker, I, like him, would prefer to have that infrastructure in place today, Mr. Speaker, but the Honourable Member, when he was in government in his power, did not address the issues that were facing Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. The reality of it is we are taking this issue seriously, head-on, making the investments, ensuring that the infrastructure reflects today's reality and will be there for the next 50 to 60 years, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Justice. The Chief Judge is it's a position of considerable influence, Mr. Speaker. The Chief Judge of the Provincial Court has a variety of important roles within the court system. The Chief Judge schedules which judges hear which cases, keeping in mind that the province is one of the biggest litigators in provincial court. The Chief Judge will decide which judges will hear each and every case that involves the provincial government. It's a position of considerable influence, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister of Justice outline the process he used for appointing the Chief Judge?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is an established committee, Mr. Speaker, that presides over that process. That process is totally independent of government. That process also provides names to government of those who have met the criteria. Judge Williams' name was one of those presented to government who met that criteria. Judge Williams, Chief Judge Williams, was the sitting incumbent of that position. And I, too, want to take the opportunity to communicate to this legislature and to all Nova Scotians the valuable work that she does in that role.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the Minister's comments about the importance of the selection committee. And I would just like maybe to ask the Minister one more time if he can talk to this House about the importance of and the significance of the selection committee in terms of the history of appointing a Chief Judge.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The process that I've just explained is a process that has been followed by consecutive governments, appointing consecutive chief judges over a number of years. If you look at the history of the appointment of past chief judges, Mr. Speaker, each of them have fulfilled subsequent terms. That's based on the performance of their work and the selection of those candidates who come forward. Presentations of names of those who come forward, Mr. Speaker, and in these circumstances, Chief Judge Williams was one of those names advanced, and given her experience and role, consistent with past practices of reappointing sitting chief judges, Judge Williams was reappointed to that position.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. The capital plan released today outlines $156.9 million for healthcare redevelopment projects in Halifax and Cape Breton. The plan provides no breakdown of exactly what that will cover and no indication of how much of that money will be spent through a P3 project. Mr. Speaker, can the minister tell this House exactly how much of that $156.9 million Nova Scotians should expect to pay for the profits the corporation that gets the very lucrative P3 deal for these hospital redevelopment plans?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this point, there's not been a decision as to who's completing the overall work with either the Cape Breton or the QE2 New Generation Redevelopment Projects. Mr. Speaker, as part of the overarching QE2 redevelopment project, as the member would know, Mr. Speaker, we've been taking steps, and for each step of the way, when there has been a project step, whether for design, work being done, or the actual capital work and construction step being done, they go through the RFP process and provider selected, and all of that information is made public at that time.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, looking through the capital plan, I see many worthwhile investments under health and wellness, and I'm glad the minister is attending to them now rather than deferring them for the next generation. However, he doesn't seem to be taking this approach when it comes to the QE2 redevelopment. Unless the minister decides to disclose them, we won't know the true costs of using a P3 contract for 30 years. Mr. Speaker, will the minister admit that there is a hospital-sized hole in this capital plan?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I'm pleased to advise you and my colleague, the member opposite, that in fact this is a once-in-a-generation investment in healthcare infrastructure. This is an investment in establishing healthcare infrastructure that's modernized, that has been reviewed and assessed by clinicians for their input as to how to build for the future, both in Cape Breton and in Halifax region, Mr. Speaker, on the mainland. This is listen to Nova Scotians, this is listen to healthcare providers, and this is investing in our healthcare system for our children as well as those people here today.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice. The Minister of Justice has outlined that he struck a committee to find the next Chief Judge. I wonder if the Minister can share with the House who was on the Chief Judge Selection Committee.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd have to go back to the department to confirm the actual individuals who sit on that committee. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court would chair that committee, Mr. Speaker. There's representation from the Provincial Judges Association. There would be, I believe, Barrister Society representation, as well as representative from government through the Department of Justice. But I can confirm those representatives.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And that committee is indeed made up of the Chief Justice of the Court of Appeal, the Associate Chief Judge of the Family Court, the President of the Provincial Judges Association, and a layperson appointed by government. This is a very important committee doing very important work on behalf of the province. Mr. Speaker, I wonder if the Minister can confirm that he provided a terms of reference to the selection committee, and will he table those terms for the benefit of this House?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The terms of reference have been in existence for some time, Mr. Speaker. One of the responsibilities of the Minister of Justice is to provide those terms of reference to the selection committee. They were available to the selection committee, and those are the terms of reference, Mr. Speaker, that the committee used in advancing the names they did to government.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister confirm that the Minister asked for and received a recommendation from the Chief Judge Selection Committee for the next Chief Judge? Did he receive a recommendation from the committee?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
I'd have to go back into the file itself, Mr. Speaker. We received names from the committee specific to candidates, And from that list of names, Mr. Speaker, it was Chief Judge Williams who was reappointed to that position. But I can confirm the specifics of what my colleague is asking.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the recommendation of that committee is something that would have been of critical importance to the minister for sure. I'd like to ask the minister, can the minister tell this House how many candidates were put forward by the selection committee?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There were 2 candidates.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the minister confirm that he accepted and acted upon the recommendation of the selection committee? Did you accept the recommendation and did you act on it?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The names that were submitted for consideration, it was in fact, as the policies and procedures allow, a decision of the Minister of Justice to advance a candidate. And in these circumstances, Mr. Speaker, it was Chief Judge Williams' name who was advanced.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a copy of the terms of reference that would have been provided to the committee. And under the minister's terms of reference, it says that when appointing the Chief Judge of the Provincial Family Courts, the Governor and Council will act on the advice of the recruitment committee, that they will act on the advice. We'll table that for the benefit of the House. I'd like to ask the minister, isn't it true that rather than accept the name that was put forward by the selection committee, the minister directed the Chief Justice of this province to add another name to the short list of names put forward?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
That's not correct, Mr. Speaker. There were 2 names advanced from the committee. The terms of reference that my colleague refers to were reviewed in detail by our most senior legal officials in the Department of Justice, and as a result of that process, those procedures, and those terms of reference, Chief Judge Williams was reappointed to the position.
The Honourable Leader. That's your 2 questions. So the Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Environment. 2 years ago, the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia made clear that this government has not adequately consulted Sibinigadig First Nation on the Alton Gas project. But the minister has done nothing about that. The minister has refused to pause the project's approvals or begin consultations. And in the meantime, Alton Gas is moving forward with the project. So when will the minister finally put a pause on the industrial approval and consult?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for that question. The province has had a very active role with the Alton Gas project. We've been involved with the environmental assessment. The application was brought forward and that was granted. We've also accepted their we also have approved in industrial approval, and that has terms and conditions associated with that approval.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
You know, Mr. Speaker, the only thing stopping the project from moving forward while this government remains in violation of treaty obligations is the treaty truck house, which is set up by Mi'kmaq water protectors in keeping with their traditional rights. And now Alton Gas from Calgary has filed for an injunction to remove those water protectors from their own traditional lands. Now, as I said yesterday, the minister's actions are leading to injunctions instead of consultations. Hardly the path to reconciliation, Mr. Speaker. So let's just be clear. Is the minister planning to allow this project to move forward without fulfilling government's obligation to consult with Sibinigadig First Nation?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can say that the industrial approval is still valid, and we are monitoring it, monitoring the terms and conditions to make sure that they do stay compliant. As for the issues with Alton Gas and the First Nations that are on the site, that is a matter certainly between law enforcement and Alton Gas. It's not the province is not involved with that. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Minister indicated that the committee put forward 2 names. But in fact, I have the letter from the chair of the selection committee dated June 13th. I'll table that for the benefit of the House. The letter says to the Minister that there were 2 candidates, but the committee made 1 recommendation to fill the position. That's the letter that was sent to the Minister with 1 recommendation. And I know the Minister rejected that recommendation and instead directed the selection committee to include another name, even though the selection committee had already made it clear who they thought the best choice was. And I can table a letter from the Minister to the selection committee on July 19th instructing them to add another name to their list despite what they wanted. Mr. Speaker, that's called political interference. That's what's happening in Ottawa. That's what shouldn't happen here, but it is happening here. I'd like to ask the Minister, was the Minister acting alone when he decided to undermine the selection process and force them to add another name to the list?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleague has referred to the terms of reference, Mr. Speaker. We have applied the process in these circumstances as is required, Mr. Speaker. There is interpretation, Mr. Speaker, within the legislation and within the terms of reference. That's what was applied here, Mr. Speaker. We looked at all of the factors and the reappointment of previous provincial court judges in fulfilling their role and their mandate. In these circumstances, Mr. Speaker, the chief judge, who was the incumbent, was reappointed consistent with the process and the terms of reference.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the terms of reference the Minister refers to required the Minister to act on the recommendation of the committee. The Minister did not act on the recommendation of the committee. The Minister instructed the committee to add another name despite what they thought was best for the court system of this province. So I'd like to ask the Minister again, who did the Minister consult with before deciding to throw out the name that was put forward by the selection committee and force his choice onto the short list as the Chief Justice?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to assure my colleague that no names were thrown out, Mr. Speaker, from the process that was applied. The 2 names that were provided were considered. We explored all of the options within the process that my colleague has outlined. We reviewed the terms of reference that were applicable in this case and have been in past cases where the provincial judge appointment has been vacant and reappointments or appointments are required. There was nobody else instructed or guided the Department of Justice or my office in this process. This process was fulfilled with direct legal input and advice from the most senior legal officials in the Department of Justice. I came to a decision, Mr. Speaker, based on all of those factors. I brought that decision forward to my Cabinet colleagues as the process requires, and Chief Judge Williams was reappointed.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister called for the selection committee to be struck. We know that that was a committee of very, very distinguished judicial minds. I've said the names of the positions of the people that were on there. The problem was they didn't pick the candidate that the Minister wanted. They didn't choose the candidate that the Minister wanted. That was the problem. So, but the Minister then instructed them to add another name to the list. My question for the Minister is, is that a decision that the Minister made on his own? Or did the Minister receive any direction from the Premier or the Premier's office on how to handle the situation where the selection committee didn't select the candidate that they wanted selected?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Within the process that my colleague has outlined, Mr. Speaker, there are policies and procedures, there are terms of reference, there is an opportunity and a process that we went through in reviewing all of those elements of the selection process, Mr. Speaker, and as I alluded to further, I spoke with, consulted with, and engaged the most senior legal minds in the Department of Justice, in our Legal Services Division, the law firm for government, and it was the direct advice and input of only those senior officials that contributed to my decision, Mr. Speaker, in reappointing or recommending the reappointment of Chief Judge Williams.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the process is well established. It's been in place for decades. It's only this government that has chosen to override that process because they didn't get the answer they wanted from the process that worked. The minister had the opportunity at the onset to directly reappoint, but instead the minister chose to strike a selection committee, possibly for political cover, for a decision that he might have already made. The minister overruled the selection of the committee. And earlier today and last fall, when my colleague asked the question, the Premier stated, he stated again the importance of judicial independence to our democracy. So I'd like to ask the minister again, were there conversations between senior staff in the minister's office and staff in the Premier's office as to how to come up with a way to overrule the selection committee's candidate and undermine the entire process?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question because he has outlined, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, the transparency that I applied to this process. He is absolutely right, Mr. Speaker. I had the unique opportunity to reappoint Chief Judge Williams without any consideration of any other candidates, Mr. Speaker. I was not required to strike the committee or ask the Chief Justice to bring that committee forward for purposes of a selection process. It was because of my commitment in the Department of Justice to the transparency of these processes, Mr. Speaker, that we actually opened that process, Mr. Speaker, to another opportunity. But it was the collective outcome, Mr. Speaker, of all the information. It was the transparent application of that process, Mr. Speaker, that resulted in the reappointment of a very competent Chief Judge.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier and the Minister spoke with a glowing pride of the process, and it is a nice process, except when it doesn't get the result they want and they have to override it. Destroying the Public Accounts Committee is very dangerous, but seizing control of the justice system is an entirely other matter. Even the Chief Justice has made a statement about it. After the minister rejected the recommendation of the selection committee, Chief Justice MacDonald resigned rather than participate in this farce.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, Chief Justice has made a statement about what happened here. The Chief Justice resigned rather than participate in such a farce again. Will the minister confirm that Chief Justice MacDonald resigned after feeling the justice system had been undermined by the minister during this process?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'll go back to the point of my colleague's question. He's trying to determine, he's trying to make a connection of a decision outside of my office where I may have been influenced by direction or someone else guiding me as to how and who should be selected. And I want to assure my colleagues in this legislature and those Nova Scotians, at no time did anyone give me direction on the selection process. It was a discussion internally within the department with my deputy minister and the most senior legal officials within the department, Mr. Speaker, that resulted in a transparent application of that process. I can't speak to why Chief Justice MacDonald resigned, other than to say that I have worked on multiple files, multiple discussions about enhancing the access to justice in the province of Nova Scotia, and I have had nothing but the most highest level of cooperation and support through Chief Justice MacDonald and his colleagues.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister may not be able to speak for Chief Justice reasoning behind his resignation, but the Chief Justice speaks for himself in his resignation letter. The Chief Justice says, representing the common interests of each and every judge in the province is fundamental to my role as Chief Justice of Nova Scotia. The recent recruitment committee process for the appointment of the Chief Judge of the Provincial and Family Courts has undermined that role. Those are the words from Chief Justice in his resignation letter. And he says that he can't participate in that type of a process anymore. So the Minister might not be able to speak for Chief Justice, but he doesn't have to because the Chief Justice spoke for himself. So will the Minister confirm that the Chief Justice resigned after feeling undermined by the Minister in this process?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I can't speak for the reasons for Chief Justice MacDonald resigning. My colleague is referring to a piece of correspondence, Mr. Speaker. I've had ongoing interactions with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, as well as the Chief Justice of the Family Court and the Chief Justice of our Trial Division, Mr. Speaker. I meet twice a year with the Chief Justices and judges of the province to build a relationship. We have over extensive discussions, Mr. Speaker, established what we believe to be the independence of the judiciary and the independence of the Executive Council, but we also speak, Mr. Speaker, about the interdependence of those two bodies and our collective efforts to work together. We have continued on that journey, Mr. Speaker. We will continue on that journey with the new Chief Justice of the province of Nova Scotia, and I look forward to that appointment.
Is that, I think you're done with your supplementary. One more? Okay, my apologies. You've had a lot of questions. I think I've lost track. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, it sounds nice. It sounds nice, but the issue is that the Chief Justice of this province felt undermined by the actions of this minister, who rejected the recommendation of the selection committee and essentially said, we don't care what you're saying, put my name on the list so I can choose it. That's political interference, and that's wrong, Mr. Speaker. It should never happen. This cabinet should never be dabbling in the workings of the court. And I'd like to ask the minister one more time. Can the minister confirm that the Chief Justice resigned because he felt undermined, as he stated in his letter?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I can only repeat, I can't speak for the Chief Justice. My colleague is referring to a piece of correspondence. What I can say, Mr. Speaker, is we continued up until his retirement, February 1st, Mr. Speaker, to maintain an open-door policy of discussion between the judiciary, who we recognize to be independent of government. We spoke about the independence of the Executive Council, and we may not have always agreed on those factors, Mr. Speaker, but where we did land is the importance of the judiciary and government working with each other to enhance access to justice, Mr. Speaker. We have done that, but I want to assure my colleague and everyone in this House, we applied the process that exists for the selection of the Chief Judge of the Provincial Court of Nova Scotia. We did that with senior legal advice and interpretation of policies and legislatures and procedures within the process that my colleague has referred to, Mr. Speaker. We have appointed a competent Chief Judge.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Okay. The process was not followed, Mr. Speaker. The committee made a recommendation. That recommendation was not the choice of the minister, so the minister instructed the committee to add another name to the list. There's nothing in the procedure that says if the minister doesn't like the recommendation, that they can put another name on the list. The process was not followed, and the process required that the minister will act on the results and the recommendations of the committee. This is political interference at its worst, Mr. Speaker. It is offensive to Nova Scotians, and the minister needs to give an explanation as to why he felt it was okay to overrule the committee, and do so to an extent that forced the Chief Justice of this province to resign and say, I don't want to be part of this, you've undermined me. Why did the minister take that action?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One thing I do want to clarify with my colleague, at no time did I instruct the committee to add names. The committee advanced 2 names, Mr. Speaker. Based on my direction, the department went back in to look at the policies and procedures and processes as laid out in the terms of reference, Mr. Speaker, and it was the legal advice and interpretation that was provided to me, the guidance that I receive on a daily basis from the most senior legal officials in this province, Mr. Speaker. And as a result of that, Mr. Speaker, we believe, and I fundamentally believe, that we have applied the process as transparently as possible. And I want to remind my colleague, as he outlined, I didn't have to strike a committee or ask the committee. We chose to, Mr. Speaker, because we wanted to be transparent. And as a result, Mr. Speaker, of those interpretations and that application, we have appointed a competent chief judge of our provincial court.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We'll take a break now and turn to education. My question is for the Minister of Education. Last month, Educators for Social Justice released a report on their survey of teachers in the province, hundreds of teachers, and one of the things confirmed by the report is that many of them are actively thinking about leaving the profession and/or leaving the province. Mr. Speaker, there's already a shortage of teachers and substitutes, and the province needs more, not fewer, educators. Mr. Speaker, what is the minister's plan to retain qualified teachers in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Just to remind the member, we've actually hired 1,300 new people into our education system, over 1,000 of which were teachers. Teachers who I believe were excited to be engaged in a meaningful profession here in Nova Scotia, and hundreds of non-teaching supports as well. So we've actually gone through a period of the greatest hiring that this province has seen in a long time. We now have the highest ratio of teachers to students than we've ever had in the province of Nova Scotia, at least on record. We now have the most amount of non-teaching supports in the province that we've ever had. That's not to say that it's an easy job or that it's without challenges, which is why we're doing our very best to increase investment in education. We've done that by about 30% and ensure that all of our great teachers in the system have the supports that they need to give the best education possible to our students.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, those are new positions, not new hires, and the experience on the ground is anything but what the minister tells us. They're new hires, but they're not necessarily new people. My mistake. People are moving laterally, and the experience on the ground is that there are not enough teachers, there are not enough substitutes, and there are not enough specialists. Mr. Speaker, teachers love what they are doing, but this government's approach to education has left teachers feeling disrespected and demoralized, and there's no one that can argue with that. Teacher shortages are a problem across the country, and the government here needs to be focused on recruitment and retention soon, or teachers will be as scarce as family doctors. More than half of the teachers who responded to the survey I mentioned before said that the government's legislated contract had not improved their situation or had in fact made things worse. And the public seems to agree. Almost 60% of Nova Scotians believe the government's actions have had a negative impact on the quality of public education. Mr. Speaker, will the minister admit that his heavy-handed approach on this file has made the problems in our education system worse?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, we did go through a difficult contract negotiation that led to a legislative contract, but that's not to say our government hasn't actually acted on the interests of teachers and our students in the system. We have increased investments in education by over $300 million at a time when enrollment has declined. We have implemented class caps. We have hired new positions into the system, 1,300 in total, Mr. Speaker. And we've brought in non-teaching supports for the first time. And the feedback we're actually getting from our regions, from the front lines, is positive. Mr. Speaker. What's interesting is these increased investments that we've seen, the budgets to hire these new people, have been voted against by the New Democrats, Mr. Speaker. Do you know what budgets they did vote for? Budgets that cut $65 million out of the education system, cut reading recovery, and cut 1,100 teaching positions from this system, Mr. Speaker. And perhaps the member can explain her next preamble the discrepancy between her voting record in this House and her words in this chamber.
The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Mr. Speaker, a question for the Minister of Justice. Mr. Speaker, I heard the Minister of Justice say that my colleague was not correct, that there were 2 names advanced by the committee. But that's not the case, not originally. Why would the Minister suggest that?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I referenced 2 names because it was, in fact, 2 names that I recall being part of this discussion and this process, Mr. Speaker. That's why I've referenced 2 names.
The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Mr. Speaker, perhaps that's not what the Minister recalls, but we've tabled information today that proves that there was 1 name that came forward. Just 1 name. The recommendation by the committee. Why did the Minister not accept the recommendation of the committee for that judge as was prescribed by the process?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Well, I take exception to the way my colleague has presented that statement, Mr. Speaker, as prescribed by the process. The process is much broader, Mr. Speaker, as is outlined in all of the policies and procedures and the terms of reference that outline that appointment process, Mr. Speaker. This process internally within the Department of Justice necessitated me engaging the most senior legal officials in the department to interpret that process, Mr. Speaker, and apply it appropriately. That's what we did. There were 2 names that were initially advanced, Mr. Speaker. When we looked at the collective circumstances and the incumbent being one of those 2 names, Mr. Speaker, and the past reappointment of chief judges of the provincial court, I made a decision, independent of anybody else, to reappoint a competent chief judge.
The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we have as evidence the Chief Justice's resignation from the committee as proof that the Chief Justice himself did not feel that this process was followed. So don't look to us, Mr. Speaker, in the opposition to answer this question. The Chief Justice answered it. So, Mr. Speaker, the Minister said that nobody was instructed by his office as part of this process, but is it not the case that his office instructed the committee to go back and give him another name so he could appoint the judge he wanted to appoint?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Actually, Mr. Speaker, that's not correct, Mr. Speaker. In advancing the portfolios of the 2 candidates, which are required by the terms of reference, Mr. Speaker, the committee did not advance the portfolio of a second candidate. I simply asked for the portfolio of the second name that was part of the process, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the committee made a recommendation. The committee was struck to make the recommendation. The Minister did not want to take the recommendation, so he instructed the committee to come back to him with another name, which he preferred. But, Mr. Speaker, that undermines the whole process. That is why the Chief Justice resigned from the committee. And that is why the Minister has a question to answer which he's not answered yet, and that is why did he interfere in this process?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I know how my colleague chooses to frame these questions, and I know exactly what my colleague is trying to achieve. But I need to reassure my colleague that I did not ask for another name. I asked for the portfolio of the second name that was part of the process, Mr. Speaker. I asked, consistent with the terms of reference and the names that were being advanced, a portfolio. I needed to know that background information in assessing the candidates, Mr. Speaker. I didn't have it. It was my intention to make an informed decision because I want to remind my colleagues, I didn't have to go to that selection process. I could have arbitrarily reappointed the chief judge. And I hear heckling from my colleagues in the back. If they understood the process, Mr. Speaker, they would clearly understand what I'm sharing with them. We appointed, Mr. Speaker, we appointed a competent chief judge to head our provincial courts.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the minister tried to be transparent with the selection of the committee, but the problem was the committee didn't play along. And it's a bit of a giggle for the minister to say he wanted the portfolio of the other candidate who was already the chief judge. But apparently the minister needed to see the resume of that person. The reality is 2 candidates applied. The selection committee picked one and advanced the name. Now, Mr. Speaker, how laughable is it that the minister went back and said, can you please rank all the applicants? They were ranked. One name was put forward. He wanted the other name on the list so he could choose from it. So I'd like to ask the minister, had the minister made up his mind before he struck the selection committee? Was this just a farce to give him some cover that didn't exactly work? Or did he consider the recommendation at all?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
So Mr. Speaker, why would I advance the work of a committee if I had already made my decision specific to the presiding judge, Mr. Speaker? Why would I do that, Mr. Speaker? There's a process, Mr. Speaker, to follow. And I indicated earlier that it was my intention and the intention of the Department of Justice to be transparent in the application of that process, because I recognize how important that position is, Mr. Speaker, to the rule of law in the province of Nova Scotia. The committee, Mr. Speaker, is incumbent to follow those policies, procedures, and terms of reference. The committee was required to provide a portfolio of both candidates, and they did not, Mr. Speaker. What I did is I asked the committee for the portfolio of the second candidate. That is a transparent application of the process, and at the end of the process, Mr. Speaker, we appointed a competent chief judge of the Provincial Court of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Speaker, my question is for the Premier. I want to circle back to what's happening in Ottawa. There's been mounting evidence that the Prime Minister and his office have interfered or may have interfered in the judicial system, and I think they're right here with the appointment of this chief judge. We're trending on very similar ground. Mr. Speaker, there shouldn't be 1 second in this province where any judge thinks for a minute, I wonder what the Premier would want. And what the Minister has done with this process is kind of sowed that doubt, and that's a shame. We're closer to that situation than ever. I'd like to ask the Premier, did the Premier or other members of Cabinet realize that the Minister was undermining the entire process and overruling the recommendation of the Selection Committee?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Mr. Speaker, at no time was I involved in this process. I want to commend the Minister of Justice who laid out a process, Mr. Speaker, that has been followed by successive governments, Mr. Speaker. In the terms of reference that the Honourable Member tabled in this House, Mr. Speaker, recommended committee report. The committee shall submit to the Minister of Justice a short list of recommended candidates with précis of information about each. Mr. Speaker, the short list will normally contain not fewer than 3, Mr. Speaker, and no more than 6 candidates, Mr. Speaker. That's exactly what the Minister of Justice asked for, Mr. Speaker. And the only interference this government has ever had in the judiciary, Mr. Speaker, is we tore apart the old boys' club that was put in there by the Tories and NDP, Mr. Speaker, and made it gender equality in Nova Scotia. That's what we've done, Mr. Speaker.
Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, 2 candidates applied, and the Premier would have you believe that the Selection Committee couldn't report a recommendation unless they put 3 names forward. Only 2 people applied. You can't get a list any shorter than 2 people applied, and this is our recommendation. If the Minister needed to see a resume to know who the number 2 ranking was, then there's bigger problems in this province than what we're talking about right here. The applicants were ranked. The committee made their selection, and the government didn't like it. So in the vein of this government and creating their own old boys club and back room. They overruled the collection and appointed somebody who wasn't on the list.
The Honourable Premier.
Again, thank the Honourable Member for the question. Again, I want to read it to him again, Mr. Speaker. It said the short list will normally not contain, Mr. Speaker. We do not expect people to add names that don't exist, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, we appointed Chief Justice Williams to this position, Mr. Speaker, under the guidance of Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Justice, who's followed the process, Mr. Speaker, and I will put that Minister of Justice integrity against any member in this House, Mr. Speaker. Let me tell you, he's had a career, Mr. Speaker. He's had a career of applying the law in this province, Mr. Speaker, and he's done a tremendous job, Mr. Speaker, of being Attorney General of the province of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's not the members of this House that are weighing in on this, Mr. Speaker. It's the Chief Justice of this province that resigned. And the Chief Justice made a statement by resigning just 2 months before he was retiring and said that that minister undermined the process. That's not us, Mr. Speaker. That's the Chief Justice of the province.
Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Chuck, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could you please call public bills for second reading?
We'll now call public bills for second reading.
Could you please call Bill number 97, the Credit Union Act?
We'll now call Bill number 97, the Credit Union Act. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill number 97, the Credit Union Act, be now read for a second time. Nova Scotians can be confident in the continued safety and stability of credit union system with the amendments to the Credit Union Act. As full-service financial institutions, credit unions operate under an ownership structure of individual members. We appreciate their unique contribution to the financial sector. These amendments will help maintain strong regulation and oversight of credit unions while strengthening the safety and stability of the system. A regular review and an update is required every 7 years to ensure that oversight of the credit union sector remains current and relevant. Changes are intended to modernize and streamline operations and governance. The review identified changes necessary to update membership rules, improve efficiencies, and align Nova Scotia legislation with the other Atlantic provinces. Since the last review, the federal government changed its legislation and its regulatory framework. Oversight of Atlantic Central, which is a Nova Scotia incorporated company, becomes a provincial responsibility. These amendments can clarify provincial oversight of Atlantic Central, and membership in Atlantic Central includes 23 credit unions from Nova Scotia for a total of 40 members in Atlantic Central. Atlantic Central provides the region's credit unions with liquidity, payment, and trade services. In addition, it acts as a trade association for marketing and networking with other provinces and international affiliations. Other changes in this legislation, Mr. Speaker, include introducing electronic voting, lowering the membership to age 18 to put credit unions in a more competitive space with our banks, creating the ability to share information across jurisdictions, and enabling permanent residents of Canada to become directors. We believe, Mr. Speaker, that updating the Credit Union Act will encourage the spirit of financial co-op movement and to stimulate greater collaboration of business opportunities. Credit unions have been, Mr. Speaker, the backbone of our province, both in rural and urban communities. Mr. Speaker, I move second reading of Bill 97.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've thanked the Minister for her comments, and as I understand, what precipitated this bill was the federal government has chosen to exit this to some degree. The provincial government had to come up with a bill and legislation to backstop, to ensure that all of the regulations are being followed for the credit union as a financial institution. So, Mr. Speaker, we're certainly in favour of that because we want to protect consumers and we want to ensure the credit union has the basis from which to continue its operations which have a lot of integrity in the province. And as the minister said, there are many consumers, many customers around the province, both in urban and rural settings. I know in the constituency of Inverness, the credit unions have played traditionally a strong role in the for consumers who are trying to save money, people who are buying their first home, people needing loans for cars and other assets, and of course for the small business loan program that the province backstops. So, Mr. Speaker, we look forward to this bill passing on to law amendments and hearing any comments the public may have there, and we'll revisit it again when it comes back after that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank the Minister of Finance and Treasury Board for bringing forward this bill. We in the NDP love credit unions. They're a great thing. They've been an important part of the Canadian community for over 100 years. We've got over 1,059 individual credit union in Caisse Populaire, and we have the highest per capita membership in credit unions here in Canada. So without getting into detail on all of the reasons that we love them, we recognize that they are under regulation and that regulation needs to be revisited and renewed. We are particularly pleased to hear that the managers of credit unions were consulted on this bill, and we do look forward to more feedback and consultation when the bill goes to law amendments. We were particularly pleased to see both that the age was lowered for membership to allow more people to become part of credit unions, particularly students, and also that permanent residents will be able to participate more fully in these unions in their communities. So with that, we do look forward to hearing from more presenters at law amendments, and I'll take my seat.
Time to recognize the Honourable Minister of Finance will be to close second reading on Bill number 97, the Credit Union Act. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do want to say thank you to the members of both the official opposition and the NDP for their comments and the support, not only for the credit union movement and establishment in our province, but for this piece of legislation which provides improvement to the membership and maintains that part of our financial institutions across Nova Scotia that reach out into many rural communities. So I appreciate the comments. I appreciate the support. I too look forward to this coming back from law amendments where people have had a chance to express any concerns or support that they may have. So I now close debate on Bill number 97.
The motion is for second reading of Bill number 97, the Credit Union Act. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried.
Bill number 97, an act to amend Chapter 4 of the Acts of 1994, the Credit Union Act.
Ordered that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call Bill number 92, the Municipal Government Act and the Halifax Regional Municipality Charter.
We'll now call Bill number 92, the Municipal Government Act and the Halifax Regional Municipality Charter. The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill 92, an act to amend Chapter 18 of the Acts of 1998, the Municipal Government Act, and the Charter, and Chapter 39 of the Acts of 2008, the Halifax Regional Municipality Charter, be now read a second time. Mr. Speaker, these amendments to the Municipal Government Act and the HRM Charter will mean municipalities will no longer require legislative change to approve spending for a new municipal purpose. They will provide greater flexibility for municipalities to respond to citizens' needs. Under the current legislation, municipalities can only spend on a list contained in the Municipal Government Act and the HRM Charter. If they wish to spend on goods and services which are not on this list, a legislative amendment is required. This can restrict the services a municipality can offer or activities they can be involved in and prevent them from making decisions in a timely manner. Proposing changes to the legislation can be a lengthy process and only occurs twice per year. For example, in 2012, the list was expanded to allow municipalities to spend on energy efficiency equipment. In 2004, municipalities were allowed to spend on culverts, retaining walls, sidewalks, curbs associated with private roads. In 2001, the legislation was changed to allow spending on trails. Mr. Speaker, we want to ensure municipalities are able to seize and leverage opportunities without having to come back to the provincial government for approval through a legislative change. With these amendments, municipalities will be able to spend for municipal purposes and within their approved budgets, without the delay of having to seek legislative changes. For example, with these amendments, municipalities can choose to become involved in broadband projects. This will in turn enable municipal leaders to act in a more timely manner. It will also create administrative efficiencies. These changes will not impact municipalities' accountability or the requirement to be transparent. Municipalities remain fully accountable to their citizens for how their budgets are spent, and we will still be required to spend within the budget approved by Council. All other legislative requirements for municipal spending also remain in place to ensure fiscal responsibility and accountability are maintained at the municipal level. In other words, rather than limiting what municipalities can spend on, as we do now, we will move to only prescribing the things they are not permitted to spend on. For example, municipalities will not be permitted to provide a tax grant or other form of direct financial assistance to a business or an industry, as outlined in the MGA. Mr. Speaker, our mandate at Municipal Affairs to ensure Nova Scotians have a strong, vibrant, and sustainable local government. Municipalities that are ready to seize social and economic opportunities. To help us achieve this vision, we must continue to modernize our legislation. The amendments bring Nova Scotia in line with other Canadian jurisdictions such as Alberta, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and Prince Edward Island, where broad powers are granted with respect to expenditures. Through collaboration with our partners at the Nova Scotia Federation of Municipalities and the Association of Municipal Administrators, we're implementing sound legislation and programs that support good governance, accountability, and effective planning. Mr. Speaker, these amendments are another step forward in our work to modernize the legislation governing municipalities. In doing so, we are creating more empowered and autonomous local governments that have more freedom to consider new and innovative ways to provide programs and services to Nova Scotians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to rise and speak briefly to Bill 92. I welcome and support this legislation, and we'll be looking forward to hearing any concerns that are flagged at law amendments, but I certainly think that this bill is a step in the right direction. I know, as I'm sure many members of this House are aware, that municipalities and the Nova Scotia Federation of Municipalities have been advocating for this sort of change and this flexibility in spending for quite some time. While I'm supportive of the bill and I'm supportive of the province really, evolving into a more, I think, respectful and more equal and more collaborative approach to our relationship with municipalities, I just want to recognize that this bill is only one step in that direction. While this will allow municipalities to engage in spending without having to ask permission each time it wants to add sort of a different category of expenditures. The province is still absurdly restrictive in areas, for example, related to the new Road Safety Act. That is something that was not changed when it was modified from the old Motor Vehicle Act. So municipalities can still not set speed limits on municipal roads, for example. And I certainly in my constituency and in many others, many other sort of primarily urban and town constituencies, there have been citizens clamoring, can we post that this road is 30 kilometers an hour? Well, no, you can't. And it doesn't matter if your whole municipal council is in agreement. Effectively, the province does not allow municipalities to have that power. And we know that municipalities are the closest level of government to citizens, and really they are so fundamental to creating livable and especially walkable communities. So I welcome, really truly welcome this change, hope that it is the first of many steps. I think also, you know, in terms of places where the province still has to go, I think of the recent announcement, which by and large is positive, of the province's decision to give some greater funding to provincial libraries, to libraries across the province. But that announcement came with sort of an announcement, not negotiation, and apparently not even you know, notice given to municipalities that, oh yes, and you're also expected to pony up to almost the same amount of money as the province is putting in. You know, the province is putting in $2 million and saying, and municipalities shall give, you know, more than 1.5 million, if I'm recalling the numbers correctly. And we know that municipalities have fewer mechanisms for raising funds, and to do that, to saddle them with that late in the year, just at the beginning of a new budget process or a new fiscal year, is very, for me, almost disrespectful of the challenges that many Nova Scotia municipalities are facing. As I will never miss an opportunity to repeat, the province needs to be listening more. It needs to be in real dialogue with the folks who are showing leadership in many different locations across this province, be it nonprofit agencies, be it citizens groups, and in this case, municipalities. And particularly our rural municipalities are facing funding and viability challenges that the province needs to do a lot more to address. But particularly when it comes to this bill, Bill 92, I'm in support, and I'll look forward to maybe having more to say on third reading, and certainly to hearing comments at law amendments. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the opportunity to speak on an act to amend Chapter 18 of the Acts of 1998, the Municipal Government Act, and Chapter 19 of the Acts of 2008, the Halifax Regional Municipality Charter, which was introduced on March 5th by the Minister of Municipal Affairs. The MGA and HRM Charter allows each municipal government to manage their own budget, both operating expenses and long-term capital planning. The amendments will provide greater autonomy for each of the 50 municipalities in Nova Scotia. The Act restates the purposes of a municipality, which are A, provide good government, B, provide services, facilities, and other things that, in the opinion of the Council, are necessary or desirable for all or part of the municipality, and C, develop and maintain safe and viable communities. The Act is amended by adding in Section 14 that this, quote, this Act must be broadly interpreted in accordance with the purpose of the Act. This additional wording does make one ponder what is being considered. The minister spoke in the news briefing about broadband internet, during the release. Certainly, improving broadband internet is an urgent need for both businesses and residential use throughout rural Nova Scotia. Residents will certainly support this work to be done. However, I can guarantee that municipal councils do not have monies budgeted for this expense. The lack of broadband internet is hurting economic development throughout Nova Scotia. But will the costs of internet infrastructure be downloaded to municipal governments? What will the expectation be? What are the plans of the minister? The Act is also amended in subsection 31 by striking out, quote, budget is, end quote, and substituting, quote, operating and capital budgets are, end quote. Why was this necessary to amend? Are there hidden capital projects being proposed in the forthcoming future? Hidden projects like broadband, CFL Stadium perhaps, a port in Sydney. Just questions that I'd like the minister to answer in the future. The Act repeals Section 65. The new content is added, which includes, quote, a municipality may only spend money for municipal purposes if the expenditure is included in the municipality's operating budget or capital budget or is otherwise authorized by the municipality. and more additions allowing municipalities to have monies from operating budgets to capital budgets, provided the expenditure does not affect the total amounts estimated for the operating budget and the capital budget. These changes to the Act certainly open municipalities to less oversight and less accountability by the Municipal Affairs Department. A news release from the Nova Scotia Federation of Municipalities certainly applauds the new level of autonomy. In fact, feedback from some councillors said this Act does in fact not go far enough, citing natural persons' powers and mentioning that this is the direction that many municipalities would like to see the government go towards. There are many provinces, provincial governments in Canada that have actually gone that route, including British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, Quebec, to name a few. And I'm wondering if the minister, if that's the direction that our Minister of Municipal Affairs is heading towards. Is that what they mean when they talk about municipal modernization? Should the municipalities expect natural person powers in the future? The Act has also changed subsection 66(4) by adding, under the title Power to Borrow Money, municipalities may contribute to a capital grant to a hospital to which Hospitals Act applies. The Act has changed section 75 titled, quote, Area Rates and Uniform Charges by adding, for greater certainty, an expenditure under subsection 1 may include a contribution to a hospital to which Hospitals Act applies. My question to the minister is, why is this included in the Act? Will municipal governments be expected to pay for capital costs of hospitals in Nova Scotia? Will municipal governments be adding area rates for new hospitals? Will the provincial government be downloading healthcare capital costs to municipalities? If yes, which hospitals in the province? In my own constituency of Cumberland North, the Pugwash Hospital, the new QE2 and HRM. I think we would like to have some answers on the reason for that amendment in the Act. The Act changes subsection 81, quote, bylaw regarding payment of charges by repealing A and B, which includes removing wastewater facilities or stormwater systems and the use of wastewater facilities or stormwater systems and connecting to wastewater facilities or stormwater systems, and B, expenditures incurred for the wastewater management system in wastewater management district, and substitutes with A, energy efficiency equipment, B, renewable energy equipment, and C, equipment for the supply, use, storage, or conservation of water. Can the minister provide examples of these three types of equipment? Does it include biomass heat energy for municipal buildings, or is it only pertaining to wastewater management? The Act also repeals subsection 172A, acquisition of vacant buildings. 6, the Council may spend money under section 65 to acquire property and improve it. I assume this is repealed only because section 65 has also been repealed, but it would be nice to have confirmation of that. The remainder of the Act has similar changes applicable to the Halifax Regional Municipality Charter. There is one additional change with subsection 104A in respect to the Cogswell District Energy System. If the Minister of Municipal Affairs had an opportunity, it would be interesting to know more about this item. It is encouraging to see this Act endorsed by the Nova Scotia Federation of Municipalities. It is interesting, as a former businesswoman, the speed of government. The slow speed of government. The news release by the Nova Scotia Federation of Municipalities referenced that they identified the need for broadband initiatives as a top priority in 2016. 3 years later, we have a change to the MGA and HRM charter that will enable municipalities to engage in the financial business of making these needed improvements. It's no wonder that citizens sometimes get discouraged with us, with our government, with our slowness and lack of efficiency. I appreciate having the opportunity to speak to this bill. Our caucus would like to learn more about the purposes of the changes and look forward to hearing that in future discussions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Fine to recognize the Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs will be to close second reading of Bill number 92, the Municipal Government Act and the Halifax Regional Municipality Charter. The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleagues for their comments this afternoon. And with that, I move to close debate, second reading of Bill number 92.
Motion is for second reading of Bill number 92, the Municipal Government Act and the Halifax Regional Municipality Charter. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried.
Bill number 92, an act to amend Chapter 18 of the Acts of 1998, the Municipal Government Act, and Chapter 39 of the Acts of 2008, the Halifax Regional Municipality Charter.
Ordered that the bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call Bill number 95, the Emergency 911 Act?
We'll now call Bill... My apologies. Bill number 92 will be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs for Bill number 95, the Emergency 911 Act.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 95, the Emergency 911 Act, be now read a second time. Mr. Speaker, I introduced amendments to the legislation on March the 5th. Nova Scotia was the first province in Canada to implement a province-wide 911 system. The Act establishes a 911 as the primary emergency telephone number for use in the province and implements a province-wide system for the reporting of emergencies to emergency service agencies. Mr. Speaker, 911 helps Nova Scotians who are experiencing an emergency to connect to the most appropriate services closest to them. Our modern and effective 911 service works with first responder partners to provide timely help to Nova Scotians when they need it, whether it be police, fire, or ambulance. Mr. Speaker, under the Emergency 911 Cost Recovery Fee regulations, a fund was created in 2001 to support the operation of the 911 system. Nova Scotians have paid into the E911 Cost Recovery Fund, and they should benefit from it by having a strengthened 911 system. In Nova Scotia, we pay a fee of 43 cents per month on our telephone bills, which goes directly into this fund. But let me be clear, Mr. Speaker, we will not be increasing the 43-cent fee. Most provinces charge telephone subscribers a small monthly fee to maintain and enhance 911 systems. Mr. Speaker, the changes we are proposing to the Emergency 911 Act will help make more services available to Nova Scotians during emergencies and severe weather events. The changes will expand the mandate of the fund to complement the 911 service and will be outlined in amendments to the regulations. Similar changes were made in New Brunswick in 2011. Mr. Speaker, with more frequent and significant weather events impacting Nova Scotia, the Emergency Management Office is working with municipalities to prepare more comprehensive approaches to planning and coordinating of emergency services. We will work with our municipal partners to identify ways to strengthen emergency preparedness activities. We will also be able to use a portion of the fund to make sure comfort centres are equipped to meet the needs of Nova Scotians during emergency events. Comfort centres provide services to citizens during prolonged weather events, power outages, and/or an emergency. For example, this may include providing satellite phones or helping provide enhanced cell phone charging services for citizens during prolonged weather events or emergencies in comfort centres. Mr. Speaker, once we have amended the legislation and regulations, we will work with stakeholders and department staff to develop programming around the delivery of this initiative. First and foremost, the primary purpose of the fund will continue to be to support the 911 service in Nova Scotia. Our most recent upgrade to the 911 service was completed last March. The fee paid by Nova Scotians on their telephone bills was used to make these upgrades to the 911 service. I assure Nova Scotians there will always be sufficient resources in the fund to address equipment upgrades and maintenance of the E911 technology and service centres. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to ensure the system responds to the needs of Nova Scotians when they need it during emergencies. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the opportunity to speak on Bill 95, an act to amend Chapter 4 of the Acts of 1992, the Emergency 911 Act, which was introduced on March 5th by Municipal Affairs Minister. The Minister of Municipal Affairs stated Bill 95 will help make more services available to Nova Scotians during emergencies and severe weather events. The Act is amended by adding for the coordination of emergency services. Why was this addition needed? The Act currently states the purpose is to implement a province-wide system. Would this not also include coordination of the system? Were there problems that led to this amendment needing to be made? The Act also was amended by changing the Act to fall under the jurisdiction of the Minister of Municipal Affairs, removing the responsibility of the Minister of Justice. What was the reason for this change? How long has this been under the jurisdiction of Municipal Affairs before making this formal change? There was also an addition to Section 3. Nova Scotia 911 service means a province-wide system for the coordination of emergency services, including emergency preparedness activities and the reporting of emergencies to an emergency service agency through a public safety answering point. During the news briefing for this bill, the Minister of Municipal Affairs stated this will help make more services available to Nova Scotians during emergencies and severe weather events. This may include providing comfort centres with satellite phones or helping provide enhanced cell phone charging services for citizens during prolonged weather events or emergencies. In studying this Act, along with the Emergency Management Act, there now appears to be some duplication. The Emergency Management Act is an act to provide for prompt and coordinated response to a state of emergency. In this act, in Section 8, it states the purpose is to procure food, clothing, medicines, equipment, and goods of any nature or kind for the purposes of emergencies. This act, the Emergency Management Act, is also under the jurisdiction of the Minister of Justice, yet managed under the Minister of Municipal Affairs and that department. May I ask the Minister of Municipal Affairs, is there duplication between these two acts, and does that create some challenges for staff? What other services will the Minister be bringing forth other than comfort centres? Will the money be provided to municipalities to provide the comfort centres, and what other emergency services are being planned? The Act is also amended by striking out an implementation in a reasonable and timely manner of a province-wide 911 emergency telephone system, with the words, replacing with the words, establishment and implementation of a 911 service. I'm wondering why we're removing the words, quote, reasonable and timely manner, end quote. The Act also, under regulations, Clause 14 was repealed. It states the Governor and Council may make regulations, quote, respecting any matter necessary or advisable for the establishment of fees to recover costs for any services or materials provided in the course of the administration of this Act or regulations, and is replaced with the Governor and Council may make regulations respecting any matter necessary or advisable for the establishment of fees to, and this is the new part, support the development, establishment, implementation, and maintenance of 911 service. Why was the addition of these words, development, establishment, implementation, and maintenance of 911 service, needed? During the news briefing, the Minister of Municipal Affairs stated there is a significant surplus in the Emergency 911 Cost Recovery Fund. I believe it was stated that the surplus sits around $8 million, which is based basically on having approximately $500,000 a year in surplus. Currently, the department charges 43 cents to every phone line in Nova Scotia. One can assume that the changes over the years from having one traditional phone line in your home to having multiple phones per family has led to the increase and has led to this surplus. Mr. Speaker, I'm confident that most Nova Scotians feel overtaxed. And since there is a surplus, I'm wondering, did the Minister and his department consider reducing the fees, which would reduce taxes on Nova Scotians? In discussing this situation with my colleagues, we would like the Minister to consider lowering the fees and also ask the Minister to consider using the surplus to enhance cell phone service across the province. The 911 service is supposed to be province-wide, as stated in the Act in Section 2. Yet we know that there are too many areas of this province that do not have 911 service on their cell phone. Yet each cell phone line is being charged a fee to pay for the 911 service. My colleague from Pictou West had a citizen call 911 in an emergency, and the call went to a cell phone tower in PEI. This lack of 911 service to this man in Pictou led to a significant delay in him receiving emergency services. I asked the Minister of Municipal Affairs to consider using the money collected on phone lines to increase cell phone coverage by adding infrastructure of cell phone towers throughout rural Nova Scotia. $8 million would make a significant impact. During the news briefing, the Minister of Municipal Affairs did state he is planning to strengthen emergency preparedness activities. I encourage the Minister to speak with his counterparts in municipalities about current deficiencies in availability and emergency management training. The training is not always available based on the needs of municipalities. Having an effective and efficient 911 emergency service includes emergency preparedness activities, and this is essential for the people of Nova Scotia. I do want to thank the Minister of Municipal Affairs and the staff in his department for their work on this Act, and our caucus looks forward to hearing the responses to our questions and to our suggestions of Bill 95. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the government for bringing forward this bill. I think I am interested, and I'm sure that the opportunity to understand this better will present itself through law amendments and maybe also in some more conversations in the halls about why these changes and why now. I think it's interesting the context that the Minister of Municipal Affairs has given, because frankly it's the closest I've heard to this government talk about preparation for the real impacts of climate change and the increase in severe weather events. In the time that I have been in this chamber, we've had the drought in southwest Nova Scotia, which has required a lot of response from municipalities, certainly in terms of providing drinking water. We've had the floods in Cape Breton. So certainly I think this is the right time to be looking at our systems and thinking about, how we're going to make sure that those systems are ready to respond to the eventualities that, we cannot envision in this moment, but which we should anticipate will arise. I'll say on a sort of personal citizen level, I'm looking forward to this opportunity to sort of understand better the interplay between 911, EMO, and EHS. And maybe I'll get to see my former colleague from Sackville-Cobequid appear at Law Amendments. I don't know. But I remember when Dave Wilson announced that he was moving to a job at 911, I thought it was directly related to his previous work as a paramedic, only to discover that no, 911 and EHS are quite separate. That to me is interesting, and I think that there's going to be a bit of a learning process through the law amendments process and through the debate on this bill. Again, I welcome this as an indication that certainly within the public service and within the Department of Municipal Affairs, there's recognition that this is the time to be ensuring that our systems are ready. So I'll look forward to further discussion as this bill moves forward. Thank you.
Time to recognize the Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs. It will be to close second reading of Bill number 95, the Emergency 911 Act. The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And again, I want to thank my honourable colleagues opposite for their comments on today's debate. And with that, I would move to close debate on second reading for Bill number 95, the Emergency 911 Act.
The motion is for second reading of Bill number 95, the Emergency 911 Act. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried.
Bill number 95, an act to amend Chapter 4 of the Acts of 1992, the Emergency 911 Act.
Ordered that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This concludes government business for today. I move that the House now rise and sit again tomorrow, Friday, March 8th, not 2008, 2019, between the hours of 9 a.m. and 1 p.m. Business will include second reading on bills number 99, an act to amend Chapter 23 of the revised statutes of the Assessment Act, and bill number 101, an act respecting the registration of tourist accommodations. And with time permitting, move to address and reply.
Motion is for the House to adjourn to rise again tomorrow, Friday, March the 8th, between the hours of 9 a.m. and 1 p.m. Would all those in favor of the motion please say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. The House now stands adjourned until Friday at 9 a.m.